The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, from the threat of annexation to the struggle to define Canadian culture, the Agenda's Week in Review brings you all the highlights from the past week. Up first, John Michael McGrath and yours truly discuss a new report into the Greenbelt scandal. On Pauly is next.
Hi folks, John Michael McGrath here. Just a quick note before we start today's episode. Liberal leader and Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced a 25% retaliatory tariff on American-made automobiles. This mirrors the tariff that Donald Trump has imposed on all auto imports into the U.S. This is just part of the discussion that we're going to have about tariffs going forward, and we didn't have time to mention it in today's episode because it was announced as we were recording it, but we wanted to make sure you had that information before we went on. So thanks so much for watching, and on with the show.
Hey, partner.
Hello, sir.
Little sugar to start with there.
Absolutely.
And I missed you last week.
Yes, we held the fort down. I think we did okay.
Actually, you did fabulous. And thank you to Jessica Smith-Cross from the Trillium, who pinch hit for me last week. I do need to... what do I say? I do need to share with you how broken my heart was.
You have some notes.
After I do have notes because I did watch, of course. You wore a sports-related jersey last week.
I did.
You wore a Blue Jay jersey.
Yes.
And and you saved it for a week when I was not here, where I could really enjoy the fact that I was having a positive influence on you because you're wearing a sports jersey. Why would you do that to me?
Well, I will accept some responsibility of this, but, you know, it's that confluence of the week you weren't here happened to also be the week of the home opener, and I'm not entirely responsible for the Blue Jays calendar. So, yes, so some other fortuitous time in the Blue Jays calendar this year, I will find an excuse to wear some kind of Blue Jays insignia on
and
the pod.
that would worm your way back into my heart once again. I'm glad to hear that. Now, this week, as you can see, I'm firmly planted on Earth. You're firmly planted not on Earth.
Somewhere in the solar system.
Out in the solar system somewhere, because I get it. That's all.
Yes.
That's Mercury, Venus, Earth.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go, the solar system. Whereas, you know, the weather today?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely balmy. I think it's,
Yes.
I mean, it's pushing 20 degrees here. So needless to say, my thoughts start to turn to driving up Highway 400 to Highway 69,
Yes.
over the 17, down to Manitoulin Island, down 6, and I'm starting to think about that now.
Starting to plan opening the camp up.
I am indeed. Oh, good for you.
See?
Camp.
I've been paying attention. Been doing this for a few years now.
There we go. Now, we have often joked on this podcast about the fact that I used to work with your father back in the day,
Yes.
and now I'm working with your father's son,
Yes.
which I assure you doesn't make me feel ancient. Don't worry about it. But it's a big time for your dad, right?
Yes. Yesterday was his 75th birthday,
Isn't
and
that
I hope he
wonderful?
doesn't mind me letting the number out into the world. Yeah, an important milestone for him. Dad, happy birthday. And, you know, I've been thinking, I think the last time we mentioned a milestone birthday of my father's on the podcast was before we were on TV. It was 5 years ago for his 70th, and it was COVID. And you and I were talking about my dad. You were in your attic, and I was in the linen closet of my home.
Right. That's right. Well, your dad may be 75, but he sure doesn't look or act 75.
He has stayed very, very active.
Yeah.
You know, an above average dad, a really, really above average grandfather. He's really putting the work in with
Hang on a
his
sec.
grandchild.
Hang on a sec. An above average dad? More than an above average grandfather? Come on, we can do better than that. He's an awesome dad.
Yes, and but truly, truly enjoying this part of his life too. So
That is wonderful. Now, his is not the only significant red letter date today.
Yes.
I have, this one's going to be a bit nerdy, I'm afraid. And I actually...
mean, that's our brand.
I brought this in from home. Can I show you? Sheldon, meet me on camera 3 if you would for a second here. This, I actually have this up in my living room at home. 132 years ago today, the very first ever Ontario legislature had its very first ever sitting. And As you can tell, can I point to a few things here? I mean, that might be the press gallery up there, and no, that is not my picture up there. I did not cover these events. But here are the members of the first Ontario legislature, and somewhere in that picture is John Sandfield Macdonald. I think that's him right there, who was our first ever premier.
Yes.
Not John A. Macdonald, who was the first prime minister. Yes. This is John S. Macdonald, the first premier. And I just thought this was cool. It's on this date, 132 years ago, the first parliament sat, and so I brought this in to show everybody.
I'm so curious about the timing there, because the election for that first legislature was in the summer, because they had to hold an election after the British North America Act created, the province of Ontario in July of 1867, and so.
But it came later.
Held the election and not actually sat the legislature for months and months and months. Things worked differently back then. But that is just sort of occurring to me now that they took their time.
I guess so. Now, I want to do one other, just before we get to our three issues here, I want to do a follow-up on something we raised a couple of weeks ago. And that is, of course, there were a lot of really interesting storylines emerging from the Ontario election just passed, right? 3 straight majorities for Doug Ford, 3 straight second-place finishes for the NDP, official party status for the Liberals for the first time in, whatever it is, since 2018. Yeah. There was one more historic milestone that we have speculated about, but we weren't sure. But now I'm sure. I asked the good folks at the Ontario Legislative Library to look into this, and they just got back to me because you and I were marveling how Bobby Ann Brady not only won election as an independent in 2022, but she got re-elected as an independent in the riding of Haldimand Norfolk at the end of February. She won by 2,000 votes 2 elections ago. She won by 20,000 votes in the election just passed, and she is the first independent ever in Ontario history to be re-elected as an independent. So I think that's pretty cool, and we wanted to bring it to everybody's attention.
Yeah, this is something we've discussed before. And, obviously the legislature has had independents, but it's vanishingly rare for someone to be elected as a true independent, right? You will very often see somebody who maybe they were booted out of a caucus, but they were at least initially elected under a party banner. Mm-hmm. It's extremely rare for somebody to win their first seat in the legislature truly on an independent basis. And in fact, in direct opposition to the Tories who had previously held that seat. Yeah. And so obviously noteworthy that she won re-election, that she won it with such a huge margin. And you do wonder, what is going on between her and the premier and the Progressive Conservative Party leader, Doug Ford, that they cannot come to some kind of modus vivendi in a riding that would otherwise be a lock for the Tories.
It's one of the safest Tory seats anywhere. Yeah. But they have a very personally antagonistic relationship. When she got up to ask a somewhat pointed question in the legislature, Doug Ford's answer to her was, don't get comfortable over there. Yeah. This is after she won the first time. Don't get comfortable over there. We're coming for your seat, and you're not going to be back here when we go back to the polls whenever that happens. Yeah. Well, she got the last laugh. She's won 2 in a row, and good for her.
There are definitely ridings in this country where, to joke about it only slightly, you just need to be the right party and be able to fog a mirror. But I aside from everything else, I appreciate that the voters of Haldimand Norfolk also kind of told the premier to take a hike there as well.
I want to give a little shout out here as well. Well, maybe not a little one, a big one. Jessica Shepherd and Kate Terrich at the Legislative Library poured through election return books and parliamentary guides, which I'm sure took a very long time, so that I could accurately and conclusively tell everybody about the history made by Bobby Ann Brady. So, Jessica and Kate, props to you, and thank you so much for your help.
Yeah, the Legislative Library, just an extraordinary resource.
I've used
them before, and they cannot say enough good things about them.
And with that, let's get off to issue 1. Wednesday was Donald Trump's so-called Liberation Day. Premier Doug Ford said it should be called Termination Day because of all the Canadians and Americans who are going to lose their jobs because of Trump's tariffs. JMM, let's get the audience updated with the latest.
Oh, gosh. If we're able to, it doesn't make a ton of sense. I'm going to just put that out right from the beginning. The big news here is a global tariff of 10% that the president has imposed on all imported goods to the United States, basically a minimum tariff level of 10% on all countries, and also places that are not countries, and I'm going to get back to that in a moment.
I think I know where you're going.
So far, Canada and Mexico have been spared this particular announcement, but previous announcements about tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods are merely suspended at the moment. They have not been repealed. So this seemed like relative good news when it looked like we had sort of dodged a bit of a bullet. The 25% tariff on foreign-made cars is still is going to go forward. It will not directly apply to all Canadian cars. They are going to be brought in under the process of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, the successor to NAFTA that Donald Trump negotiated in his first term of office and then proceeded to believe that it's the worst trade deal ever. Automakers are not loving this as far as announcements go. This still hits them with a kind of an onerous process of proving domestic content, that kind of thing. So, for example, we still see automakers reacting with unease with the state of tariffs right now. There is also still the tariffs that were announced about steel and aluminum. That seems to be going ahead as well. Prime Minister and Liberal leader Mark Carney has said there is a potential for retaliatory tariffs on things like American pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. We might see counter tariffs on lumber. Obviously, Canada and the U.S. have a long-standing disagreement about how we pay for lumber and how they pay us. So it's still a bit of a mess after Wednesday.
A mess and a work in progress. I'm interested that you said Liberal leader and Prime Minister Mark Carney, because, of course, during a writ period,
yes,
while all the leaders are campaigning, there is what they call the caretaker convention, and government is supposed to sort of be over there running itself, and we're not supposed to refer to the Prime Minister as the Prime Minister, only as the Liberal leader. However, as we saw with the Ontario election, when you know what's hitting the fan, the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party had to be referred to as Premier Doug Ford when he was chairing the Council of the Federation and going down to the United States to be the Premier, even though it was in the middle of an election campaign. And Mark Carney's doing the same thing. He's taking time off the hustings every now and then as the Liberal leader and putting the other hat back on as Prime Minister so that he can formulate a response to what has transpired south of the border. So how's that going?
So the Prime Minister has said that Canada will respond with, quote, purpose and force, and will impose countermeasures against American tariffs. What products exactly will be hit with what kinds of tariffs is not clear as we record this. There is a very long tradition of governments when they seek to impose retaliatory tariffs. They get very creative about which products they hit because you want to really get Americans' attention. So you hit like politically sensitive exports, right? So if you want to raise a ruckus in Florida, you impose a tariff on orange juice concentrate, that kind of thing. So we will have to wait and see what those kinds of measures are. And there is still there are still some voices of optimism, if I could put it that way. Premier Ford has been on American news doing the rounds again, or still, and he said this week that he believes that there's a path to get back to zero tariffs between the U.S. and Canada, which is obviously the end goal we want to get to, right? We want to get back to the situation where we were, where there's functionally zero tariffs on the vast majority of traded goods between our two countries, which was, of course, the situation on January 19th of this year. This was not like the distant past.
Yes, indeed. Now, normally we bring in the mailbag later on in the program, but we're going to advance it a little bit here because we've got something that's right on point. So why don't we go through that right now?
Right. So here is a question from listener Marco Niederegger in Hawkesbury, Ontario, which is just east of Ottawa. He writes, Good day. As I understand it, tariffs are essentially taxes on domestic consumers, and while the intention may be to encourage buying local, that's not always a feasible option. For example, I've heard that many bookstores in Canada may be forced to close if tariffs are placed on American books. Why impose tariffs at all, knowing they may harm our own economy? Would it not be more strategic to place surtaxes on goods the U.S. relies on from us, such as gas, electricity, or raw minerals, and then use that revenue to support sectors negatively affected by U.S. policies? I may be missing something, but I'd really appreciate some clarification. Love the show. Marco.
Okay, JMM, help Marco with an answer here.
Okay, so Marco is absolutely correct that Canadian tariffs will add to the economic harms of both Canadian consumers and potentially to producers as well. For example, if you're a manufacturer who relies on American goods to assemble a final product and suddenly those inputs are hit with tariffs by the Canadian government, that isn't just going to hurt Canadian consumers, it's going to hurt that manufacturer, that hypothetical manufacturer. Since U.S. tariffs are paid by American consumers, and I know the president denies this to be the case, but it is in fact literally true. Since U.S. tariffs are harming Americans, some Canadian economists have argued that the rational course of action here is to basically not respond, right? Let the Canadian economy adjust to higher tariffs and move on, right? There's no sense in doing, by this line of argument, there's no sense in doing more harm to ourselves than the Americans are already doing. And I think that's like a coherent enough suggestion, a coherent enough worldview, but I don't believe it reflects the current state of affairs.
You think?
Because, and this is where I go back to, the places that Donald Trump has applied tariffs to include uninhabited Antarctic islands, the British Indian Ocean Territory, which is an island whose only industry of any note is a joint U.S.-UK Air Force base. They have applied tariffs to places that make no sense, and they've one of the other examples is they have applied a 10% tariff to the United Kingdom, lowest kind of tariff that they have announced this week, and a 20% tariff to the European Union. Now, people might guess from my surname that I come from Irish descent. There is, in fact, a British and EU border that runs through the island of Ireland.
Right.
And I can imagine truckers are already warming up their engines for the amount of smuggling that is going to be happening across that Irish border. So, in one sense, it's absolutely correct to say we don't need to add on the economic harms. We are not really talking about economics in this world. We are talking about politics, and we are talking, unfortunately, about political responses to there's no other way for me to say this, a senseless actor, an irrational actor, and we are going to be calibrating our responses in that mindset, not in a purely economic one.
Get off the fence and tell us what you really think. Come on. We've also got that Nerds on... what's that, Nerds video?
On Politics.
Nerds
yes,
on
we did
Politics.
a YouTube video all about the history of tariffs. And, this goes back to the very beginning of this country, John A. Macdonald, the national policy, the waxing and waning of tariffs and our relationship with the Americans. And we even talk a little bit about where we find ourselves now.
Right. So find that on the YouTube...
Nerds on Politics, tariffs would probably get you there.
There we go. And with that, let's get off to issue 2. A former executive assistant to Premier Doug Ford violated the province's lobbying rules, according to Integrity Commissioner J. David Wake. Nico Fidani Diker lobbied to have a client's parcel of land removed from the Greenbelt so it could be developed, and offered 2 public office holders tickets to a Maple Leaf hockey game. That's the beginning of the story. JMM, pick it up if you would.
Right. So Fidani Diker was the Premier's executive assistant between 2018 and 2020. He had also worked for former Toronto Mayor Rob Ford during Rob Ford's time in City Council, and he is a Progressive Conservative Party member. There were a handful of people who followed Doug Ford from his time in municipal politics into provincial politics in 2018. So Fidani Diker is not the only person who did that. The Integrity Commissioner investigation looked into his failure to register as a lobbyist while working for a developer who had hoped to remove their lands from the Greenbelt. In case our audience has forgotten, the provincial government had planned to make boundary changes to the Greenbelt. This was announced after the 2022 election. That would have netted certain developers billions of dollars if those changes had gone forward.
I think $8.25 billion somebody
Yes,
figured it out. It's
yes.
a lot of money.
And that's pure windfall to the developer, right? The province then reversed its decision. There is an ongoing RCMP criminal investigation into this. As of now, nobody has been charged. We have no real news from the RCMP on that front. But according to the Integrity Commissioner's report, Fidani Diker placed these two office holders into a potential conflict of interest by offering them those game tickets.
Two, can I get my inverted commas going here? Office holders. We'll come back to that in a second. In the meantime, Marit Stiles, NDP opposition leader, said she was going to ask the Integrity Commissioner for more clarity on all of this and some specific details from the investigation. So let's hear from her, shall we? Marit Stiles.
We all have a sense of who's probably involved. I don't know why the Premier won't just come clean and tell us who it is. But if he will not do it, then I will go back to the Integrity Commissioner and ask the Integrity Commissioner to be clear with the people of Ontario about who these public office holders are.
Well, of course, the report did not name the public office holders who were lobbied by Fidani Diker, although our friends at the Trillium have confirmed that one of them was Doug Ford. Ontario Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie also reacted to the news on Monday, so let's have a listen to what she had to say. Bonnie Crombie.
Laws were broken that were designed to regulate lobbying practices. We are aware that other members of the Premier's staff are being investigated. And so I think what we're seeing here is one of the dominoes has fallen. All roads lead to the Premier's office.
So what happens next?
Fidani Diker is still allowed to lobby. He isn't facing a penalty per se for these actions. The one punishment he's really faced is having this report published with his name and the actions he took described, which is something that the Integrity Commissioner is able to do. Both Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie have said a lobbying ban should be considered.
Okay, so that's basically naming and shaming that's happening so far. Does the report in any way affect the RCMP's apparently ongoing investigation of all of this?
So also, according to our friends at the Trillium, Fidani Diker's lobbying work has not been the focus of the probe. That said, the optics of someone so very close to the Premier who put public office holders into conflicts of interest is, I'm going to venture, bad and not what the Premier would love to have dominated a news cycle this week.
And I'm going to venture that this is not the last time we talk about this on this podcast.
I mean, it hasn't been the last time since 2022, right?
There you go. And with that, off to issue 3. Well, this has been a big week for candidate nominations in the federal election. The ability of political parties to nominate candidates in the country's 343 ridings ends on Monday. But the big story this week is a significant number of candidates who have been forced to quit the races that they've been in because of various forms of malfeasance. We have a bit of a list here, JMM. Shall we start to go through this?
Yes. I like the word malfeasance, by the way. So the biggest story of the week, I think, is uncritically the Liberal former candidate for Markham Unionville, Paul Chang. He was the former sitting member in that riding. He told a Hong Kong-based media outlet that the Canadian public could claim a police's bounty that had been placed on his Conservative rival, Joe Tay. He said Tay could be brought to the Chinese consulate in Toronto. I just want to say there's a real fear in the Chinese diaspora right now about the extent to which the Beijing government has people, watching activities outside of China and in Canada right now. So as obviously bad as this accusation was within the Chinese diaspora, this is a really, really sort of noxious thing for Chang to have said after, frankly, dragging the pain out for a lot longer than he needed to. Mark Carney eventually accepted Chang's resignation, I guess, but did not dismiss him early on. Anyway, so Chang has stepped aside in the race, and the Liberals will find a new candidate in that riding.
Is there more?
Oh, we've just gotten started. Mark McKenzie, who was running for the Conservatives in the riding of Windsor-Tecumseh Lakeshore, has dropped out after CTV News unearthed a 2022 podcast recording where he jokingly suggested that Justin Trudeau should be hanged. Also a noxious suggestion and something that people just shouldn't say. I'm just going to go out on the limb there.
Go out on a limb and say that.
The Conservative Party acted pretty swiftly when the CTV News report came out and turfed McKenzie.
Is there more?
Yes, another Conservative candidate. They dropped their flag bearer in the Montreal riding of Laurier Ste. Marie over controversial social media posts promoting a variety of, let's say, popular internet memes and right-wing conspiracy theories, including the idea that Bill Gates is trying to manipulate public health for profit through vaccines, or that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was provoked by the expansion of NATO.
Is there more?
In fact, the Liberal candidate in the riding of Calgary Confederation was kicked off the ballot for failing to disclose an assault charge in years past. The charge was ultimately stayed, but party officials who vet candidates don't like it when you forget to mention that you face criminal charges.
You think? Is there more?
Yes, a little bit more at least. There were anti-Semitic remarks by the New Democrat candidate in Mississauga, Erin Mills, Ehab Mustafa. Mustafa, in one Instagram post, claimed that Jews controlled the government, saying, quote, groups like the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs have been influencing policy behind closed doors. It's time to take back our democracy. He went on, Jews were influencing decisions at the highest level. Zionism is not about Jewish self-determination, he added, it's about power. And just the cherry on top referred to the attacks of October 7th as a resistance operation. So, he is, as of this recording, he is still an NDP candidate. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has not disavowed him.
Should I ask again? Is there more?
So if we want to include two candidates who were former MPs under their party banners and were told not to run again, we can include Han Dong from Don Valley North. Han Dong was also a former MPP under the Win Liberals. And you can also talk about Chandra Arya in Nepean, who was asked to step aside so that Mark Carney could run in that riding. These are both examples of candidates who were accused of either foreign interference or at least, in the case of Arya, a really bizarre case of him saying that, him not telling the Prime Minister or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that he was meeting with the Indian Prime Minister Modi, and then when asked about it by the Globe and Mail, he said, well, I meet with lots of people. Okay. So yes, those two candidates were sitting Liberals in the last Parliament, or were elected as Liberals and are not running again.
We should say Han Dong has very much vehemently denied that there was any foreign interference involved in his situation, and I think he's in the midst of a lawsuit still against Global Television, who reported that originally. Yes. So we definitely want to put that on the record. Okay, as far as I know, as we sit here taping this, I think that's it in terms of candidate difficulty so far, but I don't think we can assume that that's the end of this practice. With social media, we all have a digital footprint, and given enough time, effort, and research, the research bureaus of all of the political parties are working overtime right now trying to find inappropriate stuff about all the candidates out there, because, of course, this does knock a leader. Just look at Mark Carney for the past few days. Yeah. Until Chang stepped down, this knocked him off his message track for about 3 or 4 straight days. This is a dog that's going to come back to bite many candidates going forward, I suspect.
Well, and I just want to add to the point about Carney. Mark Carney started off this week by talking about housing policy and made a really substantive announcement of I would say, a very ambitious housing policy. And I wrote about it for TVO.org for the website. And as far as I can tell, the whole Chang affair, if I could put it that way, totally derailed his announcement. He went and he did his availability. It took questions from reporters, and every single question was, unsurprisingly, about Chang, and nobody asked him about housing policy. Mm-hmm. And it just stepped over one of the most important announcements he's made in the campaign so far. So, I'm trying to do my part to still focus on these important policies where I can, but it's like political malpractice.
There used to be a guy who worked for Mike Harris in the Ontario Premier's office named Paul Rhodes. Yeah. His dad actually was a cabinet minister in Bill Davis's government. Paul Rhodes used to say his advice to his first minister was, figure out where the story is going and then go there.
Yes.
And that way, you don't drag out over 3, 4, and 5 days a story which inevitably is going to take you to a place you have to go. Yeah. I have to say, if we're just objectively looking at this, Pierre Poilievre's team made a decision very quickly that their candidates did not meet a certain standard. They cut loose from those candidates right away, and those became, minor blips on the Conservative hustings. Not the case with the Liberal Party, where this thing dragged out and dragged out and dragged out and raised a lot of questions about whether I think Mark Carney used the expression, this was a teachable moment for him. And yeah, it sure was.
Yeah. And then, we mentioned a New Democrat candidate as well. There is some speculation as to whether the NDP are even going to be able to put a full slate of candidates up by Monday. So that will just be one other thing that I will be watching for this election so far.
Indeed. Okay, with that, let's move off to your column, my column. Okay, everybody, time now for our regular feature. You know it, you love it. It's called Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for our website, TVO.org, over the past week. What have you got for us today?
So we are in the midst of a lot of economic uncertainty, and some people are pitching big ideas to help the country weather the potential loss of our biggest customer south of the border. And I'm a big fan of ambition in government, right? I kind of lament that I was born too late for the Apollo program. And I don't want to discourage governments from being ambitious, but I also think there's a lot that Ontario could do right now that would just get us to like middling level, that would still be very, very good. And, I look at the state of Ontario's correctional centres, which are horribly overcrowded, and we have learned from reporting from the Toronto Star, people are dying in extremely high numbers in correctional centres. I believe it's the Maplehurst Correctional Centre. Almost as many people have died in the last year as died across the entire province's set of correctional centres just a decade ago. So, I'm not saying that we should build prisons as a jobs program, but we happen to have a badly overcrowded prison system right now. The situation is at least as bad in the courts, where judges and crowns are badly overworked, and we just need to expand the court system, as we have had to do periodically in our history. And again, it's not that we want like courts as a jobs program, but we need these things, and the courts are like a core function of government. This is not a trivial thing. And then even when you get sort of further afield, we live in Toronto, and I think a lot about our transit system here, and like just getting the TTC to the reliability it had like 10 years ago. We're not, again, talking about the distant past here. We're not talking about some lost golden age. Just, getting the subway to be that reliable again, getting, frequent buses, these kinds of things. You could employ a lot of people just to do these things. And I think that we should, again, as much as I love ambition in public policy, as I love that, the speech that John F. Kennedy gave about, sending a man to the moon and returning him to the earth within a decade.
No, he didn't say decade. He said decade.
Decade, yes.
That New England accent.
All that said, we could also start small and get a lot done. So
let's just get the basics right.
Yes. So that was my column this week.
Good. Very nice.
And you?
Well, you used the word lament in there, and I was doing a little lamenting this past week as well. In fact, I was, for whatever reason, in a very sentimental mood and decided to do a piece about absent friends, about people who are no longer with us and who I wish still were with us, because I would... one of the joys of the jobs we do is that from time to time, you just call people up and you find out what they're thinking. Yeah. And that is something I would love to have been able to do with so many of the lions of our political past. And I can't do it. And I would love to know, for example, what Bill Davis or John Turner, two gentlemen who were first ministers who I knew reasonably well, what they would be thinking about what Donald Trump is doing right now, and about the federal election that we're in the midst of right now, and the way the polls have just so dramatically changed over the last month. So I wrote about that. I wrote about former cabinet ministers in the Davis government, Larry Grossman and Margaret Birch, who was the first ever female cabinet minister in Ontario history, and Betty Stevenson, who was the first female education minister, first female labor minister, first female treasurer of Ontario, first female head of the Ontario Medical Association. She was amazing. And I can just imagine what Betty Stevenson would be saying about Donald Trump right now. I think she was 4'10" and one of the toughest people I ever met in my life. I think about the backroom advisors like Hugh Segal, who was a chief of staff to a former prime minister and a former premier, or John Duffy, who of course was a real great liberal backroom guy, strategist, one of the smartest guys I've ever met. Love to have been able to call them up and just find out what they're thinking right now, and alas, we can't. So I raised my glass in a column to absent friends. Yes. There we go. I'd actually add one more name to the mix, and this happened after my column was published, and that is again, for people of a certain generation, like your dad, incidentally, the name Claire Westcott was a very big deal 40 and 50 years ago. Claire Westcott was one of Bill Davis's closest friends. The two men talked almost every day after they both got out of politics. He was working in the Premier's office, and I don't know if this was his official title, but it's certainly what he did. He was a fixer. Yeah. He was a fixer. If somebody called the Premier's office and said, we really would appreciate your help getting this issue moved forward because it would be really good for business, Claire Westcott was the kind of guy who said, there's an orphan's shelter just up the street from Queen's Park where there are 50 kids who don't have parents who live. And I bet they'd love to go see the Maple Leaf hockey game this Saturday night. What do you say you get some tickets for them, give them the tickets, and then we'll see what we can do about your problem. Now, you'd never be allowed to do any of that today.
No.
But that's how they sort of fixed problems back in the day. And Claire Westcott just died this week. He was 100 years old. Wow. And he started as an Ontario Hydro lineman.
Right.
And he worked his way all the way up to senior advisor in the office of the Premier of Ontario.
Probably before it was called Ontario Hydro, probably back when it was called HEPCO.
Oh, yeah, right? I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right. Anyway, to all those guys, and many, many more, Roy McMurtry, there's another guy I think about too, former Attorney General back in the day. May they all rest in peace.
Absolutely. And with that, let's go to the mailbag.
If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love hearing from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. Okay, what do we got this week?
We have a question from Ron in Ottawa who writes, Hi, Steve and John. In trying to choose who to vote for in the coming federal election, I am hesitating. As a lifelong Ontario PC supporter, I've never been comfortable with the National Conservative Party. They've earned my vote at times. Other times I've supported the NDP as a strong opposition to hold the government to account. This time I'm very hesitant, and mostly because Doug Ford is so reluctant to support Pierre Poilievre. I have grown to really like, trust, and believe that Doug Ford cares about the people. May not always be right, but he seems to try hard and care. If he doesn't like and support Pierre, I know it isn't just personal. He took a birthday cake to Mayor Chow, for heaven's sake. He can put personal and politics aside to build relationships and work for the people. Can you guys do a deep dive into why Doug Ford refuses to support Pierre? There must be a lot more behind the scenes. Thank you. Keep up the great work. Ron in Ottawa.
Ron, I like this note because you clearly are thinking through at multiple levels here. This is like three-dimensional chess in Star Trek. I'll use an analogy you can appreciate. And I don't know how deep a dive we can do, but we can put a few things on the record here about why the Premier of Ontario, progressive conservative, has told his troops, I don't want anybody working for the federal Conservative Party of Canada, even though you could argue ideologically there are some overlaps in their Venn diagram.
Yes.
Not as many as once upon a time, but there are some. Okay, let's go down the list. Doug Ford well understands the historic practice of Ontarians ticket splitting. When they put Conservatives at Queen's Park, they tend to put Liberals on Parliament Hill. If Pierre Poilievre suddenly becomes Prime Minister of Canada, that's Conservatives federally, Conservatives provincially, and with the next election coming in the province of Ontario, however many years down the road, maybe 4, maybe not, Doug Ford understands that people may want to make a change provincially if there's a Conservative Party in power federally. We should also point out Jenny Byrne is a name that gets mentioned a lot. Yes. She is the campaign director for Pierre Poilievre. She used to work in Doug Ford's Premier's office, and apparently it did not end well. So while all politics is local, all politics is also personal.
Yes.
And there may be some bad blood there. In addition, Pierre Poilievre apparently waited 3 weeks before congratulating Doug Ford with the traditional congratulatory phone call that one would make after the Ontario election was over. I think there's some people at Queen's Park whose noses were probably out of joint about the fact that, you saw Doug Ford out for breakfast with Mark Carney. You saw Doug Ford inviting Chrystia Freeland to his swearing in of his new cabinet, but, radio silence from the federal leader. So I think some people are a little bit concerned about that. It's interesting that both Ford and Poilievre started their leadership as kind of disruptive, populist conservatives, railing against gatekeepers and trying to open up the system for Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario. Doug Ford, I think, particularly during COVID, very quickly learned that that was not playing well with the people of Ontario. He pivoted fairly quickly to become a more moderate, pragmatic, progressive conservative. He's won 3 straight elections. You can't argue with success. Mr. Poilievre has been resisting taking that same more moderate, more pragmatic approach, and we'll see obviously what his fate is on the 28th of April when we have this federal election.
You mentioned COVID. I think one thing that
is worth remembering is that, I mean, some people were expelled from provincial conservative politics.
Yes.
I think of Roman Baber, the former MPP here, and he was expelled from Ford's caucus. He has been recruited as a federal conservative candidate, and there are other people in that category. I could think of people who were highly critical of Doug Ford during COVID that Pierre Poilievre recruited, and I think that says something about the direction that Pierre Poilievre was taking the Conservative Party, that, at least until Trump blew everybody's plans up, it's not just, we could talk about Jenny Byrne, we could talk about the differences. I think in their life stories is also, an important point to mention, that, Doug Ford did have a career in business, as was brought up in the debates. He inherited his father's business, but not exactly a self-made man, but he had a real career outside of politics before he entered politics with his brother in 2010. Pierre Poilievre has just held an MPP, or sorry, not an MPP, an MP seat for a very long time. It's he kind of came into politics almost straight out of university.
I think he was 24 years old or something when he won his first election.
Very different life stories, very different styles of politics, despite both having that, as you mentioned, that sort of disruptive populist side. And just a very, very different very different people, and it's kind of hard to sum it up any better than that in my view. I don't know, maybe actually they would get along famously if they held more phone calls, but clearly there is just some breach there.
Indeed. You want to give the email address one more time?
Right. Again, if you would like to ask about any content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, April 4th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Before we sign off, we always like to offer special thanks to our crew for shooting the show, making it sound good, making it look good. So thanks, guys. And until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Adam, to you first. You wrote an article for your newsletter entitled The Annexation Manifesto of 1849. What prompted you to write the piece?
Well, you won't be surprised to learn it was recent news in headlines. There are all these moments in Canadian history that, stretch back to before Confederation, where annexation by the United States is sort of this recurring theme, and there are a bunch of big sort of flashpoints for it. One of the big ones is this annexation manifesto from the 1840s. So it felt like a thing to write about these days.
So for those who think this is the first time any of this has ever happened, that's a big NO on that.
Yeah, far from it.
Okay. Now, while this annexation manifesto was making its way through the population and popular discourse at the time, there was a counter-argument which Toronto Public Library has discovered. They're apparently in the archives of the City of Toronto. And Sheldon, bring this up, please. This is a copy of the document, which is a countermeasure to the Annexation Manifesto, and I'll read a little bit of it here. It says, "We, the undersigned inhabitants of the City of Toronto, having learned from the public press that a document has been circulated for signatures in and about the City of Montreal, advocating the annexation of Her Majesty's Province of Canada to a foreign state, our firm determination to resist all attempts at trifling with our allegiance, transferring us from the mild and just rule of our gracious sovereign to the United States of America or any other foreign power." This was courtesy of the Toronto Public Library. Had you seen this archive before?
Yes, that is the counter petition against the Annexation Manifesto, and the library has wonderful resources from all sorts of history on it, and it is, I think, one of the more remarkable documents you'll find on there. There's this moment where a bunch of leading business leaders, lawyers, politicians in Montreal in particular signed this annexation manifesto asking for the United States to take over the Canadian colonies, the province of Canada in particular, which is now Ontario and Quebec. And then this swift, overwhelming pushback, which was kind of centered on Toronto and what's now Ontario, of this big counter petition and a big movement that brought together a lot of sort of bitter political rivals, some of the biggest rivals in Canadian history, who were united in the idea that this could not be allowed to happen and that we needed to speak with a united voice against it.
We'll get to the pushback in a second. Dominique Marshall, let me get you in here to talk about the events that led to the creation of the Annexation Manifesto to begin with. What can you help us with on that?
There's a lot of disappointment with what had happened in 1848 when what is now Ontario and Quebec were united and responsible government was given to the Canadians. So that was after the rebellions of 36, 37, when lots of people wanted to leave England and they shipped over Lord Durham to reorganize Canada. So first legislature votes to actually exonerate to some extent the rebellious people and give them back some, there was some compensation on rebellion losses, and also a global, and also generally the Britain did not want any preferential treatment for Canadian goods. So that was all a move to give a bit more autonomy to Canadians, but also not to treat them with favor economically at a time when there was a global recession. So a funny thing happened. People who were former enemies, like the English merchants of Montreal, were disappointed at the economy of it all, but also at these bills that were kind of exonerating the rebellious people. But the people who had rebelled, some of them, the most extreme of them, were disappointed by the conservatism of that government and were quite happy to join the United States as well. So let's join the United States if we're merchants in order to bolster our economy. Let's join the United States if we are radical French-Canadian former rebellious people, because we like the idea of a real republic.
Canadian elections are almost never about foreign policy. They're almost always about something else. This one clearly is about foreign policy. Does that make this election particularly intriguing to folks like you?
Well, absolutely. It's our 15 minutes of fame. No, I mean, certainly this is really unique geopolitical times. The way that the Trump administration has repositioned the United States has really basically undermined the foundations of our system of foreign policy for maybe 80 years, if not more. So I think that it's really brought a lot of people to kind of think about, well, what's important? What are the things we can hold on to? What do we need to do more? How can we sort of better position ourselves for the coming future? And that's sparked quite a bit of debate all across the political spectrum.
Stephanie, if you're into foreign affairs, is this your time?
It is and it isn't. I always find with Canadian elections that increasingly we are talking about issues with international salience, such as, back in 2015, there was the Syrian refugee issue. 2021 was about the pandemic. And obviously right now we have the bright orange light that is Donald Trump and all the kind of chaos that is going along with that. But at the same time, I feel like there is a lack of serious discussion about what we need to do. There's a lot on tariffs. There's a lot on infrastructure building. But how are we going to actually diversify our trade? Who are we going to do it with? What institutions are we going to use? This is largely absent. And what Canada's role in the world should be in a world where there is a retrenching United States also seems to be missing from the conversation.
Vesma, do you share that concern that something's missing, even if the accent is on foreign affairs in this election?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Stephanie, so no surprise here. But yeah, I think there's really a lot of missing details. There's a lot of, I think, broad sketch of what we expect. I think a lot of analysts and scholars can probably read between the lines, but I think for a lot of Canadian voters, there's a lot of mystery still on what are the actual policy positions. And I think that's actually by design. I think what has been very troubling for a lot of Canadian politicians is that when these issues do come up, it's often not a very big concern for Canadians. I think this election is going to be a bit different that way because we do have the trade war going to be looming over us. But I think in general, because it's not a high priority for most Canadian voters, polls after polls often tell us that that I think this time in particular, there are a lot of contentious issues. And so I think the sort of political landscape wants to avoid on the specifics on purpose.
Adam, what say you on this?
Yeah, I think we're talking about the world a lot right now, but I don't think the election is really about policy, because the elections are about choices. And I don't think the leaders are that far apart on, for example, response to the United States. In both cases, we're going to respond with counter tariffs of some sort. So I think what the election seems to be about is who can lead us to this new place and this new world order and this need for Canada to look out for itself in a way that's different. And I think that's different than the details that Stephanie and Besma are looking for. I don't think they're there. I don't think Canadians are asking for them as much as they're asking for who will make us most comfortable figuring those details out.
So am I reading between the lines accurately when it sounds like you are unimpressed so far with what you've heard from the major parties as it relates to specifics?
Well, I think it's more that I'm not surprised. It makes perfect sense for our political leaders to respond to our needs, and we aren't asking for how many consulates are you going to close in the United States, are you going to move them to another country. We're asking, will you make us feel confident that we will be in a good place if you are leading us into this unstable, insecure world?
Stephanie, what are you not hearing that you wish you were hearing from, let's just take the two major parties which the polls would suggest are the two that have a shot to win this election? What do you wish you were hearing?
Right. And I to be fair to Adam, I agree. It's not surprising that we're not hearing these things. It's just, the academic in me is maybe slightly out of touch with the common person in Canada who's just wondering what the price of fruit is going to be in 6 months from now. So what I would like to hear is not so much the specifics about closing consulates, to be fair, but, we have heard skepticism, particularly from the Conservative Party regarding certain international institutions. And I don't say this in a politicized way, but some international forums, they take a more skeptical view towards the UN, towards groups like the World Economic Forum, almost certainly. So what is their idea for the right forums that we should be going to? Who are the allies? The government has an Indo-Pacific foreign policy. Is that something that they want to continue, both parties? And so it's interesting, Mark Carney, when he was the prime minister for, I guess, a week, one of the first things he did was actually go overseas to the UK, to France. He has said that rather than increasing trade with China, he would like to work more with like-minded allies. That was kind of a hint towards the approach that he would like to take. I would like to hear more from the Conservatives, like in broad strokes, what is their approach to international institutions, alliances, etc., going forward?
The Canadian identity that's under threat. What is that anyway?
Oh, great. Thanks for an easy one to start. First off, thanks for having culture on this show. I mean, it is underrepresented across culture. It's certainly underrepresented in our elections. It's something that a lot of people aren't talking about. But identity is story. Culture is story. And so if we have other people telling our stories, if we have people who don't share our experiences, who come from different mindsets, who are playing with a different deck of cards, telling us who we are rather than letting us tell each other who we could be, I think there's something lost there. And I think you're seeing that right now with what's happening south of the border when someone is telling Canadians, maybe here's what you should be. And I think Canadians' response is to say, well, actually, we're something different than that. And that something is not, to answer your question, a monolith. There are many Canadian identities. And for me, having a breadth of experience, taking in culture, books, music, film, radio, whatever it happens to be, from different perspectives, helps me shape my own sense of who I am and who I am in the country called Canada.
That is about as good a definition of something impossible to define as I've ever heard. So well done.
Best. Thank you.
Well done. Yeah. And you mentioned film, so let's talk film. And Tanya, I want to go to you on that. If I want to see a Made in Canada film, what constitutes a Made in Canada film?
Well, I think you're going to get more than one answer from different people that you speak with. It's interesting we're having this conversation now, actually, because the CRTC is doing a number of sessions with a lot of people in the screen industry about CanCon. What is Canadian content? For me, I would like more films, television shows showing that it's placed in Canada. That's a big one for me. Of course, we want Canadians working in the content, but right now that is the best marketing tool that we have for our product to go around the world and for people to actually recognize that the location that they're looking at is Canada. And I think that's a big part of our Canadian identity. Just yesterday, I think the Black Screen Office did a summit and they had many Black Americans there. And many of the people at the summit were emailing me going, why are Black Americans always so shocked that there are any Black Canadians? Like, why do they think that's bizarre? And it's because they're not actually aware of the content when it goes out, that's Canada they're watching, and these people are Canadians.
And I guess when you say shot in Canada and looking like Canada, you don't mean made to look like an American city, but shot in Canada, right?
Exactly. And I would go as far to say that I encourage international productions that want to shoot in Canada and say it's Canada. Let's embrace them as Canadian content too, because they are helping get that branding out there. We all know when we see Big Ben, we know that's London. When we see the Sydney Opera House, we know we're in Australia. We need those kind of identity things happening within our content.
Gotcha. Andrew, you heard the reference to CanCon, the Canadian content regulations that have been, well, you tell me, how significant a rationale behind why we have a domestic music industry?
If you look at countries around the world of similar size, perhaps, let's say Australia as an example, who don't and haven't had that, and you see what is played on the radio and the affinity that the domestic audience has for domestic artists, you'll see a dramatic change, actually. So I think on balance, it has been a success, but you have to keep in mind that over the last 50 years, the goal was to build a Canadian industry for a Canadian audience. In other words, domestic artists for a domestic audience in a time when markets were regulated by borders. But in music, that is no longer the case. And so as referenced with the CRTC consultations that are in process right now, what we're really needing to grapple with here is how do we present as Canadians in a global market? Not so much how do we find Canadians to listen to Canadian music, because Canadians do listen to Canadian music. So that part of it has been, I'd say, a huge success.
And that is the agenda for Friday, April 4th, 2025. Monday on the program, we'll ask some of the country's top pollsters about what goes into political polling. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you back here on Monday.